Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy.
At Sierra, you'll always find apparel, footwear, and gear for 20 to 60% less than department and specialty store prices. But right now it's clearance time, so you can save even more on everything you need to get active and outside. Visit your local Sierra store today.
Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from Jerome Cardan, a biographical study, written by W.G. Waters and published in 1898. This story looks at the life of the famous Italian Renaissance mathematician Gerolamo Cardano, or, as it's known in the anglicized version of the name, Jerome Cardan. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those of you who are new to the podcast, you may not know that it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community we've built together. This podcast is self-made and self-produced. That is why you'll hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with the support from subscribers and patrons on Patreon, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. Thank you to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week, whether through the website or your podcast app. Your messages mean the world to me. My goal is to keep this podcast free and accessible to everyone. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, here are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your podcast app and leave a comment. Become a subscriber for $2.99 per month. This also creates for an ad-free listening experience. If subscribing is not possible, an easy way to help is simply by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. You can also visit boytosleep.com. If you would ever like to say hello to me, and I always appreciate hearing from listeners, you can visit me at boytosleep.com and leave a message. If you know someone else out there who would benefit from a good night's rest, you're welcome to share this podcast with them. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. Jerome Cardan, a biographical study by W.G. Waters. Preface. No attempt is made in the following pages to submit to historical treatment the vast and varied mass of printed matter which Cardan left as his contribution to letters and science, except in the case of those works which are, in purpose or incidentally, autobiographical, or of those which furnish in themselves effective contributions towards the framing of an estimate of the genius and character of the writer. neither has it seemed worthwhile to offer to the public another biography constructed on the lines of the one brought out by Professor Henry Morley in 1854, for the reason that the circumstances of Cardan's life, the character of his work, and of the times in which he lived, all appear to be susceptible of more succinct and homogeneous treatment than is possible in a chronicle of the passing years, and of the work that each one saw accomplished. At certain junctures, the narrative form is inevitable, but an attempt has been made to treat the more noteworthy episodes of Cardan's life and work, and the contemporary aspect of the Republic of Letters, in relation to existing tendencies and conditions, whenever such a course has seemed possible. Professor Morley's book, The Life of Gerolamo Cardano, of Milan, physician, has been for some time out of print. This industrious writer gathered together a large quantity of material, dealing almost as fully with the more famous of the contemporary men of mark, with whom Cardan was brought into contact, as with Cardan himself. The translations and analyses of some of Cardan's more popular works which Professor Morley gives are admirable in their way, but the space they occupy in the biography is somewhat excessive. Had sufficient leisure for revision and condensation been allowed, Professor Morley's book would have taken a high place in biographical literature. As it stands, it is a noteworthy performance, and by reason of its wide and varied stores of information and its excellent index, it must always prove a valuable magazine of memoire poursuivi for any future students who may be moved to write afresh concerning the life and work of the great Milanese physician. An apology may be needed for the occurrence here and there of passages translated from the De Vita Propria and the De Utilitate ex Adversus Capienda, passages which some readers may find too frequent and too lengthy, but contemporary opinion is strongly in favour of letting the subject speak for himself, as far as may be possible. The date and place of Cardan's quoted works are given in the first citation therefrom. Those of his writings which have not been available in separate form have been consulted in the collected edition of his works in 10 volumes, edited by Spon, and published at Lyons in 1663. The author desires to acknowledge with gratitude the valuable assistance in the way of suggestion and emendation which he received from Mr. R. C. Christie during the final revision of the proofs. London, October, 1898. Jerome Cardan, Chapter 1. Like certain others of the illustrious personages who flourished in his time, Gerolamo Cardano, or as he has become to us by the unwritten law of nomenclature, Jerome Cardan, was fated to suffer the burden and obloquy of bastardry. He was born at Pavia from the illicit union of Fazio Cardano, a Milanese jurisconsult, and mathematician of considerable repute, and a young widow, whose maiden name had been Chiara Michiria, his father being 56, and his mother 37 years of age at his birth. The family of Fazio was settled at Gallarate, a town in Milanese territory, and was one which, according to Jerome's contention, could lay claim to considerable antiquity and distinction. He prefers a claim of descent from the house of Castiglione, founding the same upon an inscription on the apse of the principal church at Gallarate. He asserts that as far back as 1189, Milo Cardano was governor of Milan for more than 7 years, and according to tradition, Franco Cardano, the commander of the forces of Matteo Visconti, was a member of the family. If the claim of the Castiglione ancestry be allowed, the archives of the race would be still farther enriched by the name of Pope Celestine IV, Godfrey of Milan, who was elected Pope in 1241, and died the same year. Cardan's immediate ancestors were long-lived. The sons of Fazio Cardano, his great-grandfather Giovanni, Aldo, and Antonio, lived to be severally 94, 89, and 86 years of age. Of these, Giovanni begat 2 sons, Antonio, who lived 88 years, and Angelo, who reached the age of 86. To Aldo were born Jacopo, who died at 72, Gottardo, who died at 84, and Fazio, the father of Jerome, who died at 80. Fazio, albeit he came of such a long-lived stock, and lived himself to be 80, suffered much physical trouble during his life, on account of a wound which he had received when he was a youth. Some of the bones of his skull had to be removed, and from this time forth he never dared to remain long with his head uncovered. When he was 59, he swallowed a certain corrosive poison, which did not kill him, but left him toothless. He was likewise round-shouldered, a stammerer, and subject to constant palpitation of the heart. But in compensation for these defects, he had eyes which could see in the dark, and which needed not spectacles, even in advanced age. Of Jerome's mother, little is known. Her family seems to have been as tenacious of life as that of Fazio, for her father Jacopo lived to be 75 years of age. Of his maternal grandfather, Jerome remarks that he was a highly skilled mathematician, and that when he was about 70 years of age, he was cast into prison for some offence against the law. He speaks of his mother as choleric in temper, well dowered with memory and mental parts, small in stature and fat, and a pious disposition, and declares that she and his father were alike in one respect, to wit, that they were easily moved to anger, and were wont to manifest but lukewarm and intermittent affection for their child. Nevertheless, they were in a way indulgent to him. His father permitted him to remain in bed till the 2nd hour of the day had struck, or rather forbade him to rise before this time, an indulgence which worked well for the preservation of his health. He adds that, in after times, he always thought of his father as possessing the kindlier nature of the two. It would seem from the passage above written, as well as from certain others subsequent, that Jerome had little affection for his mother, and albeit he neither chides nor reproaches her, he never refers to her in terms so appreciative and loving as those which he uses in lamenting the death of his harsh and tyrannical father. In the Geniturarum Exemplar, he says that, seeing he is writing of a woman, he will confine his remarks to saying that she was ingenious, of good parts generous, upright, and loving towards her children. Perhaps the fact that his father died early, while his mother lived on for many years, and was afterwards a member of his household, together with his wife, may account for the colder tone of his remarks, while writing about her. She was the widow of a certain Antonio Alberio, and during her marriage had borne him 3 children, Tommaso, Catalina, and Joanne Ambrosio. But when Jerome was a year old, all 3 of these died of the plague within the space of a few weeks. He himself narrowly escaped death from the same cause, and this attack he attributes to an inherited tendency from his mother, she having suffered from the same disease during her girlhood. There seems to have been born to Fazio and Chiara another son, who died at birth. Jerome Cardan was born on September 24, 1501, between 6:30 and 6:45 in the evening. In the second chapter of his autobiography, he gives the year as 1500. He writes the date as September 23, but on all other occasions the date first written is used. Before he saw the light malefic influences were at work against him, his mother, urged on no doubt by the desire to conceal her shame, and persuaded by evil counsellors, drank a potion of abortive drugs in order to produce miscarriage. But nature on this occasion was not to be balked. In recording the circumstances of his birth, he writes at some length in the jargon of astrology to show how the celestial bodies were leagued together, so as to mar him both in body and mind. Wherefore I ought, according to every rule, to have been born a monster, and, under the circumstances, it was no marvel that it was found necessary to tear me from the womb in order to bring me into the world. Thus was I born, or rather dragged from my mother's body. I was to all outward seeming dead, with my head covered with black curly hair. I was brought round by being plunged in a bath of heated wine, a remedy which might well have proved hurtful to any other infant. My mother lay 3 whole days in labour, but at last gave birth to me, a living child. The sinister influences of the stars soon began to manifest their power. Before Jerome had been many days in the world, the woman into whose charge he had been given was seized with the plague and died the same day, whereupon his mother took him home with her. The first of his bodily ailments, the catalogue of the same which he subsequently gives is indeed a portentous one, was an eruption of cupuncles on the face in the form of a cross, one of the sores being set on the tip of the nose, and when these disappeared, swellings came. Before the boy was 2 months old, his godfather, Isidore di Resta of Ticino, gave him into the care of another nurse who lived at Morago, a town about 7 miles from Milan. But here again ill fortune attended him. His body began to waste and his stomach to swell, because the nurse who gave him suck was herself pregnant. A 3rd foster mother was found for him, and he remained with her till he was weaned in his 3rd year. When he was 4 years of age, he was taken to Milan to be under the care of his mother, who with her sister, Margherita, was living in Fazio's house. But whether she was at this time legally married to him or not, there is no evidence to show. In recording this change, he remarks that he now came under a gentler discipline from the hands of his mother and his aunt, but immediately afterwards proclaims his belief that the last named must be born without a gallbladder, a remark somewhat difficult to apply, seeing he frequently complains afterwards of her harshness. It must be remembered, however, that these details are taken from a record of the writer's 5th year, set down when he was past 70. He quotes certain lapses from kindly usage, as for instance when it happened that he was beaten by his father or his mother without a cause. After much chastisement he always fell sick, and lay some time in mortal danger. When I was 7 years old, my father and my mother were then living apart. My kinsfolk determined, for some reason or other, to give over beating me, though perchance a touch of the whip might then have done me no harm. But ill fortune was ever hovering around me. She let my tribulation take a different shape, but she did not remove it. My father, having hired a house, took me and my mother and my aunt to live with him, and made me always accompany him in his rounds about the city. On this account I, being taken at this tender age with my weak body from a life of absolute rest, and put to hard and constant work, was seized at the beginning of my 8th year with dysentery and fever, an ailment which was at the time epidemic in our city. Moreover, I had eaten by stealth a vast quantity of sour grapes, but after I had been visited by the physicians, Bernabo della Croce and Angelo Gira, there seemed to be some hope of my recovery, albeit both my parents and my aunt as well had already bewept me as one dead. At this season my father, who was at heart a man of piety, was minded to invoke the divine assistance of San Gerolamo, commending me to the care of the saint in his prayers, rather than trust to working of that familiar spirit which, as he was wont to declare openly, was constantly in attendance upon him. The reason of this change in his treatment of me I never cared to inquire. It was during the time of my recovery from this sickness that the French celebrated their triumph after defeating the Venetians on the banks of the Adda, which spectacle I was allowed to witness from my window. After this, my father freed me of the task of going with him on his rounds. But the anger of Juno was not yet exhausted, for, before I had fully recovered my health, I fell downstairs. We were then living in the Via Domini, with a hammer in my hand, and by this accident I hurt the left side of my forehead, injuring the bone and causing a scar which remains to this day. Before I had recovered from this mishap, I was sitting on the threshold of the house when a stone, about as long and as broad as a nut, fell down from the top of a high house next door, and wounded my head just where my hair grew very thickly on the left side. At the beginning of my 10th year, my father changed to this house, which had proved a very unlucky one for me, for another in the same street, and there I abode for 3 whole years. But my ill luck still followed me, for my father once more caused me to go about with him as his famulus, and would never allow me on any pretext to escape this task. I should hesitate to say that he did this through cruelty, for taking into consideration what ensued, you may perchance be brought to see that this action of his came to pass rather through the will of heaven than through any failing of his own. I must add, too, that my mother and my aunt were fully in agreement with him in his treatment of me. In after times, however, he dealt with me in much milder fashion, for he took to live with him 2 of his nephews, wherefore my own labour was lessened by the amount of service he exacted from these. Either I did not go out at all, or if we all went out together, the task was less irksome. When I had completed my 16th year, up to which I served my father constantly, we once more changed our house and dwelt with Alessandro Cardano next door to the bakery of the Bossi. My father had 2 other nephews, sons of a sister of his, one named Evangelista, a member of Franciscan order, and nearly 70 years of age, and the other Otto Cantoni, a farmer of the taxes and very rich. The last named, before he died, wished to leave me his sole heir, but this my father forbade, saying that Otto's wealth had been ill-gotten, wherefore the estate was distributed according to the directions of the surviving brother. This, told as nearly as may be in his own words, is the story of Cardan's birth and childhood, and early discipline, a discipline ill calculated to let him grow up to useful and worthy manhood. It must have been a wretched spring of life. Many times he refers to the hard slavery he underwent in the days when he was forced to carry his father's bag about the town, and tells how he had to listen to words of insult cast at his mother's name. Like most boys who led solitary lives, unrelieved by the companionship of other children, he was driven in upon himself and grew up into a fanciful, imaginative youth, a lover of books rather than of games, with an old head upon his young shoulders. After such a training it was only natural that he should be transformed from a nervous, hysterical child into an embittered, cross-grained man, profligate and superstitious at the same time. Abundant light is thrown upon every stage of his career, for few men have left a clearer picture of themselves in their written words, and nowhere is Cardan, from the opening to the closing scene, so plainly exhibited as in the De Vita Propria, almost the last work which came from his pen. It has been asserted that this book, written in the twilight of senility by an old man with his heart cankered by misfortune and ill usage, and his brain upset by the dread of real or fancied assaults of foes who lay in wait for him at every turn, is no trustworthy guide, even when bare facts are in question, and undoubtedly it would be undesirable to trust this record without seeking confirmation elsewhere. This confirmation is nearly always at hand, for there is hardly a noteworthy event in his career which he does not refer to constantly in the more autobiographic of his works. The De Vita Propria is indeed ill-arranged and full of inconsistencies, but in spite of its imperfections, it presents its subject as clearly and effectively as Benvenuto Cellini is displayed in his own work. The rough sketch of a great master often performs its task more thoroughly than the finished painting, and Cardan's autobiography is a fragment of this sort. It lets pass in order of procession the moody, neglected boy in Fazio's ill-ordered house, the student at Pavia, the youthful rector and Paduan gymnasium, plunging, when just across the threshold of life, into criminal excess of Sardanapalian luxury, the country doctor at Sacco, and afterwards at Gallerate, starving amongst his penniless patients, the university professor, the famous physician for whose services the most illustrious monarchs in Europe came as suppliants in vain, the father broken by family disgrace and calamity, and the old man, disgraced and suspected and harassed by persecutors, who shot their arrows in the dark, but at the same time tremblingly anxious to set down the record of his days before the night should descend. Until he had completed his 19th year, Jerome continued to dwell under the roof which for the time being might give shelter to his parents. The emoluments which Fazio drew from his profession were sufficient for the family wants, he himself being a man of simple tastes, wherefore Jerome was not forced, in addition to his other youthful troubles, to submit to that ex crata paupertas, and its incommitment miseries which vexed him in later years. To judge from his conduct in the matter of Otto Cantoni's estate, Fazio seems to have been a great disperer of wealth, as his son proved to be afterwards. His virtue, such as it was, must have been the outcome of one of those hard, cold natures, with wants few and trifling, and none of those tastes which cry out daily for some new toy, only to be procured by money. The fact that he made his son run after him through the streets of Milan in place of a servant is not a conclusive proof of avarice. It may just as likely mean that the old man was indifferent and callous to whatever suffering he might inflict upon his young son, and indisposed to trouble himself about searching for a hireling to carry his bag. The one indication we gather of his worldly wisdom is his dissatisfaction that his son was firmly set to follow medicine rather than jurisprudence, a step which would involve the loss of the stipend of 100 crowns a year, which he drew for his lectureship, an income which he had hoped might be continued to a son after his death. Amidst the turmoil and discomfort of what must at the best have been a most ill-regulated household, the boy's education was undertaken by his father in such odds and ends of the time as he might find to spare for the task. What with the hardness and irritability of the teacher, and the peevishness inseparable from the pupil's physical feebleness, and morbid, overwrought mental habit, these hours of lessons must have been irksome to both, and of little benefit. In the meantime, my father taught me orally the Latin tongue as well as the rudiments of arithmetic, geometry, and astrology, but he allowed me to sleep well into the day, and he himself would always remain abed till 9 o'clock. But one habit of his appeared to me likely to lead to grave consequences, to wit, the way he had of lending to others anything which belonged to him. Part of these loans, which were made to insolvents, he lost altogether, and the residue, lent to divers persons in high places, could only be recovered with much trouble, and no little danger, and with loss of all interest on the same. I know not whether he acted in this wise by the advice of that familiar spirit, whose services he retained for 38 years. What afterwards came to pass showed that my father treated me, his son, rightly in all things relating to education, seeing that I had a keen intelligence. For with boys of this sort, it is well to make use of the bit as though you were dealing with mules. Beyond this, he was witty and diverting in his conversation, and given to the telling of stories and strange occurrences well worth notice. He told me many things about familiar spirits, but what part of these were true I know not. But assuredly, tales of this sort, wonderful in themselves and artfully put together, delighted me marvellously. But what chiefly deserved condemnation in my father was that he brought up certain other youths with the intention of leaving to them his goods in case I should die, which thing, in sooth, meant nothing less than the exposure of myself to open danger, through plots of the parents of the boys aforesaid, on account of the prize offered. Over this affair my father and my mother quarrelled grievously, and finally decided to live apart. Whereupon my mother, stricken by this mental vexation, and troubled at intervals with what I deemed to have been an hysterical affection, fell one day full on the back of her neck and struck her head upon the floor, which was composed of tiles. It was 2 or 3 hours before she came round, and indeed her recovery was little short of miraculous. And that concludes tonight's readings. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this book. I also hope you're feeling a little drowsy. If you're not quite tired yet, you're always welcome to listen to another episode of the Boy to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.